So again, my name is Eric, and I'm a program officer within the Office of Rare Diseases Research at NCATS, which is the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences. It's one of the many different institutes and centers that we have at the National Institutes of Health, for the NIH. The NIH is your primary federal agency within the U.S. government that funds research as a whole, and specifically within the NIH, our center, NCATS, focuses on translational science, which is really about how do we translate between different areas within research. So much of my discussion today with you in this presentation is going to focus really on the language of science and just laying a foundation so that the other speakers are able to build on that. When we talk about the different stages of research, oftentimes some of the language we'll be using involves terms such as basic research or preclinical research or clinical research, eventually thinking about implementation and public health. Much of this, when you look at the science itself and what's involved in it, for clinicians, this is really about etiology or pathophysiology or ultimately creating a therapy and having guidelines. But that's really oftentimes confusing for patients and patient groups to understand. For patients, really this entire process is about trying to understand what's the cause of my disease. Are my symptoms due to this disease? Are they the same as others? Are they something to expect in the future from this? Is there a diagnostic process to this? Is there a clear test? Is there a lab that I can use, or an imaging study, or a finding on my exam that tells me whether or not I have this disease? And ultimately, how do I gain access to any of those therapies? And what does this mean in terms of my prognosis or expectations of my life? Sometimes the difficulties with patients and patient groups in terms of being able to engage in research is understanding how science is built altogether. When you're trying to move a disease from this state of observation and what you can see into intervention, or what we're doing in terms of trying to either stop the disease from progressing or creating, therapies or procedures that can help alleviate some of the symptoms, what we're ultimately trying to generate from this entire scientific research process is really data to support the uses of those therapies, those drugs, or those techniques, or different other types of resources to actually create that change. So underlying all of this interaction, all of these different terms here, is really data. That's what progresses research forward. And if you think about that from that angle, and understanding that 65% of you are entering the space of thinking about a registry, or starting to think about a natural history, really from a patient group angle, what a registry ultimately is about translating stories of your patient community into data. Again, data is what drives research forward. And the question here is really about how do you collect that data, and where do you store it, and what types of data are you looking for? So what exactly is a registry with that in mind? A registry, and this definition comes from our colleagues at the Agency for Healthcare Quality and Research, or AHRQ. Registries are an organized system to collect uniform information. And again, uniform information is a good way to really just to describe data with a defined purpose, target population, and method. Oftentimes, we talk about this both in terms of who's providing the data. Is it coming from the participants in terms of the patients or caregivers that are filling out the information? Is it coming from the clinicians that may be actually working with those patients and putting in information into a registry, as well as what types of information they're trying to collect? Is it contact immigration, demographics, medical background and history, or actual clinical data coming from evaluation when they're doing an examination with you in terms of labs, or what's in your EHR, your electronic health record? How's that all kind of collected together? And what a registry does is it takes all of this information into a platform and allows you to collect information, again, in a systematic way for multiple people across your entire disease population. So registries are really tools to collect data. And I think the main thing to kind of keep in mind with this is, again, there are many different types of data. The key here is really understanding what is it you need to lay that foundation for the future of your disease in terms of science. So oftentimes, when we talk about this entire process, we talk about small elements, individual clinical trials, patient preference data, or patient experience data, or biomarkers, pathophysiology concepts. We oftentimes focus on one part of the entire equation, when much of this is really based on what is your research agenda for your organization and for your patient population. is there a specific goal you have in mind, whether it be trying to create new therapies, having a new diagnostic, or establishing a diagnostic in the first place, and better understanding quality of life. Much of this stems from really creating that foundation. So having a clear research agenda in mind, and then using that as a way to then guide any of the actual studies you're going to do and the data that you're going to use. Those act as pillars to really build on future studies you may be wanting to then initiate. So ultimately, if your goal is to try to create, again, a new therapy, then you need to have all of this foundation built up before you can do this. And that's oftentimes where registries come into this, is really trying to provide that foundation, either to help with recruitment in terms of your clinical trial, to help in terms of providing comparator data, or to provide information to help understand what patients are needing out of those therapies. So this is kind of just a big overarching picture of what's on the landscape that you're having to do and how registries fit in this. But I think one thing to in particular remember is that this is really about a marathon, not a sprint. So when we talk about the entire process of going from taking a compound and thinking about a drug that you can develop from that, oftentimes this can take years, up to 13 years on average, 10 to 13 years to develop that drug. And this is not linear. Sometimes you'll go through this, you'll fall back, and not all trials will work out. So that's the thing to keep in mind when you're building this entire process, this entire house in some ways. That foundation that you're laying with your registry, with your natural history, is helping you build out all the tools that you need so that if you go through this marathon, you've done the workout plan, you've built all of the different exercise routines, all of the habits that you need in order for you to actually succeed. And this is not about one single event, but a marathon of different events.